Now, 2 weeks ago, I was in Jordan, listening to a mother describe how she fled there from Syria with her children after her husband, a baker, was arrested, tortured, and as she later found out, shot dead and dumped in the street by President Assad's forces. Now, there is not one of us here who does not ask ourselves the question, why do people do this to their brothers and their sisters? Now, maybe we shall never know the answer, but there is another question that we should try and answer. What should we do when these things happen? Now, I was brought up on the parables of the New Testament, and the one that left the greatest mark on me was the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Luke's Gospel records that it was the question, "And who is my neighbor?" that prompted Jesus to tell the story of a man who was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, who was robbed and beaten and left for dead by the side of the road. And while the priest and the Levite both separately chose to pass by on the other side of the road, it was, of course, the Samaritan who stopped to help. And having told the story, Jesus then asked his questioner, "Which now of these three, thinkest thou, was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He that showed mercy on him." Then said Jesus unto him, "Go, and do thou likewise." And I have chosen this parable as the basis of what I wanted to say today, because when we see the extreme suffering of others, what is our responsibility to our neighbors? Now, for some, this is, let's be frank, a very difficult and uncomfortable moral choice, and they hope it will pass them by. Some say it's none of our business. Others respond by renouncing violence, an aspiration we should all share. But until all 7 billion of us do so, then we have to face up to the effects of violence on its victims. We know that war is the handmaiden of poverty and that civil wars on average result in 20 years of lost development. It is no accident that Afghanistan and Somalia have the highest rates of infant mortality in the world. Both of them are poor, and both of them have been racked by conflict. The causes of war are many. The legacy of colonialism, resources, ethnic and regional tensions, politics, nationalism, ideology, religion, terrorism. And in the years to come, we may see added to this list people increasingly fighting over energy and land and the thing on our tables, water. So when is it right to act to prevent these things? Now, looking back on the Second World War, which led to the bombing of this cathedral, did more people die than would have lost their lives if Hitler had not been confronted? Maybe. Was the war an expression of failure? Most certainly. And yet, was the Second World War justified? In my view, it was. And from its ashes came a determination that such a conflict should never happen again. And its expression was the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and 3 years later, the UN General Assembly adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 3 states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 28 says, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. And yet for millions of people, these rights, so nobly expressed in that declaration, have remained just words on paper. The refugees from Syria I met in Jordan couldn't have been clearer. They said very simply, the world has forgotten us. Now, why is this so? In part because those affected lack the means to do anything about the conflicts themselves, and because we, the rest of the world, lack the will, or we act imperfectly, or not at all. This will not do. First and most importantly, because we should uphold the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They mean something as the ultimate expression of our responsibility one to another. And yet without the rule of law and peace in all countries, they mean nothing. Imagine if the world consisted only of the United Kingdom, and someone argued, well, no, it's okay if we have peace in Coventry, but there is civil war in Leeds and genocide in Glasgow. What would we think? Now, of course, this does not happen because these rights are enjoyed in all parts of our country. And yet we are one world, and having created the United Nations, we have a duty to ensure that these same rights are available to all of our fellow human beings, whichever part of the planet they were born on. The second reason why this matters is because interdependence defines the human condition more clearly now than at any other time in human history. The effects of conflict elsewhere are felt here, whether it's watching it on our television, seeing the flow of refugees, look at the events of the last few months, feeling the repercussions in our own politics, or experiencing the impact of terrorism on our own lives. And as we know, as the world's economies become more dependent on each other, the consequences for trade and for travel are increasingly serious. The third reason is that no country can progress while it is mired in conflict. So, those who care passionately about overcoming the scars of poverty, disease and squalor must be equally passionate about the part that peace and stability play in helping to bring this about. And the fourth reason is because new threats beckon. Unchecked, climate change will affect our future security. If people can no longer live where they were born and brought up because their homes are underwater or it has stopped raining, then they will do what human beings have done throughout history. They will move in search of a better life. And they may be coming to live near you and me. And their number will dwarf anything that we have seen thus far. Now, reflecting on recent history, what I think it teaches us is that whether it was Sierra Leone under the RUF and the West Side Boys, the Rwandan genocide, Kosovo when Muslims were being murdered in Europe's backyard, or Syria today, the world needs to find a way of dealing with crimes against humanity. In some of these cases we did act, in others we failed. And it's not that the international community doesn't care, but there is not yet a settled and united will to act, and we lack the capacity to do so in an effective way. So how can we build this will and this capacity? Now, one of the problems we face is the concept of national sovereignty. A country invading another, well, that's one thing, but when terrible events happen within a country, some still say, well, that's an internal matter, it's none of anybody else's business. Now, we used to hold exactly the same view of domestic violence here in the United Kingdom. 40 or 50 years ago, if the police were called because of reports that a man was beating someone up in the street, he would be swiftly arrested. But if the victim was his wife or his partner behind a closed front door, then the prevailing attitude in our society not that many years ago was, well, it's a domestic dispute and it's not really for us to get involved. But this doesn't happen anymore. A crime is a crime, and the sovereign state of the kitchen or the bedroom no longer provides any protection against enforcement of the law. And I think we are witnessing exactly the same process as the world tries to deal with this problem internationally. An increasing number of voices are saying that leaving people by the roadside of conflict to fend for themselves simply cannot be right. And so was born the concept of responsibility to protect. Developed by the Canadian government's International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2001, it led, following Ban Ki-moon's report on how to implement the responsibility to protect, to the UN General Assembly adopting a resolution in 2009. Seeing state sovereignty not as a privilege, but as a responsibility, R2P, as it is called, seeks to prevent and stop genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And it explicitly accepts that the international community does have a responsibility to act in certain circumstances. Now, I support R2P very strongly, but it is not without controversy. And so I want to try and address directly the reservations and concerns that people have raised about it. The first is authority. Who is to decide what should be done? Well, for me, the answer is very clear. It should be the Security Council of the United Nations that we created at the end of the Second World War. It's why we brought it into being. The UN has both a unique responsibility because of its authority and a unique legitimacy. And yet we see from history that the United Nations has not always been capable of agreeing on what should be done or of acting effectively when it has decided what should be done. Now, we have to accept that the veto exists to bind the world's major powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, into the United Nations. But with that veto comes a great responsibility. And that is why the French government has proposed that in cases of mass atrocities, permanent members of the Security Council should voluntarily agree not to use their veto. I think this is a very important proposal, and it should be strongly supported by the United Kingdom and other countries. But what if the UN will not or cannot act? Then what? Is there an argument for standing on one side? Now, not in all cases, some would argue, including me, as our support for intervention in Sierra Leone and Kosovo demonstrated. Now, others take a different view and say that, well, if there isn't a UN mandate, then there can be no legitimacy for action. The second issue is that people fear military action occurring prematurely. And that is why diplomatic pressure and public pressure should always be the first resort. It can work. Look at the recent example of Western sanctions and the part they have played, an important part, in persuading Russia to implement the Minsk agreement in Ukraine, where the level of violence is certainly much lower now than it was at its height. We have also learned that a single camera or a single reporter bearing witness to an atrocity and the shame that can be brought upon those who are responsible can have a power equal to 1,000 resolutions. The reason why the British government changed its mind in September about our country taking more Syrian refugees was because of that photograph of little Aylan Kurdi lying dead on a beach in Turkey. That's why the country said, this isn't good enough. We need to do more. The third issue is deciding when states should act. Now, agreeing a threshold is difficult, it's contentious. Achieving consensus on whether diplomatic options have been exhausted or not is, let's be honest, fraught with difficulty. And yet, if we wait for evidence of genocide to become conclusive, then it may be too late to do anything or to save anybody. The fourth issue is practicality. If a decision is taken to act, then who's going to undertake the work? If it involves military intervention, then whose troops will be used? How many? Under whose command? With what resources? What mandate? And what is the plan for after military intervention? Now, one way of answering these questions is to continue to build capacity regionally in the world to be able to handle peacekeeping. Take an example. Was it right for the African Union to take the lead in Darfur and in Somalia? Absolutely. Both because Western forces in Islamic countries in these circumstances would not have been accepted, and because these are conflicts in Africa's backyard. On mandate, peacekeepers need the tools to do the job, and that includes the ability to protect and intervene if necessary under Chapter 7. And where there are people to protect or a peace to keep, we need more peacekeepers. Now, at present, there are about 125,000 military and civilian UN peacekeepers operating around the world in, I think, 16 missions, compared with only 11,000 a quarter of a century ago. Despite this, there still aren't enough for all of the missions that the UN would wish to run and to the high standards that rightly we expect of them. For as well as numbers, there's a question of training, equipment, capacity, particularly as regional institutions build their own peacekeeping. And I think that this is an area in which Britain could and should play a much bigger part, given the skill, experience and expertise of our armed forces. There are currently just under 300 British peacekeepers contributing to UN missions, and another 300 are soon to deploy to South Sudan and Somalia. I think this is simply not good enough, and I call on the government to set out in the forthcoming Strategic Defence and Security Review how the UK can play a much bigger part in UN peacekeeping in the years ahead. And when action has been taken, it needs to be followed up to stabilise a country, to have a political process, to get decent governance. There is no substitute for the parties to the conflict finding their own way out of it through compromise and reconciliation, the spirit that Coventry exemplifies. Lastly, what is the consequence? Now, there are two types of consequence, that of acting and that of not acting. In the case of Sierra Leone, the outcome of British and then UN intervention was beneficial. The country remains poor. It's just had to deal with the terrible Ebola outbreak, but it is largely free of violence now, and it has taken the first steps on the road to recovery. In the case of Afghanistan, where the world responded to 9/11, the removal of the Taliban enabled about 3.5 million of the 4 million people who had fled the land of their birth to return to the country. The conflict, however, continues. Many lives have been and are still being lost, but the aim remains to enable the elected Afghan government to look after its own security as politics, we hope, brings a peace settlement. In Somalia, the American troops who went in to take part in a humanitarian operation ended up in a gun battle, and they were replaced in time by African forces. But despite recent progress, parts of the country remain deeply troubled and insecure, as the recent attack by al-Shabaab in Mogadishu demonstrated. More positive has been the impact that international cooperation has had on piracy off the country's coast. And if you look next door at Somaliland, actually part of Somalia, but in Somaliland they have showed what you can do if you make your politics work. It is a country that is largely peaceful. For the people of Rwanda, the consequence of our not acting was devastating. In 100 days, just under 1 million people were killed. That's the equivalent of 6 million people being murdered here on the streets of the United Kingdom, on our street corners, in our schools and our churches, as the world stood by and watched. Anyone who has read Romeo Dallaire's book, he was in charge of a small UN contingent at the time, Shake Hands with the Devil, the Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, will weep with rage at what happened while we've failed to do anything. And while the Syrian civil war has continued, over 200,000 lives have been lost. Half the population have had to flee their homes. Half. That's like 32 million people in Britain no longer living where they were 5 years ago. The scale is extraordinary. And the barrel bombing by the regime and the brutality of ISIL Daesh continue, as Rosin Hanjoul was telling me about earlier. Now, the world has got to be much more effective in dealing with conflicts like this before they turn into brutal and bloody civil wars. The responsibility to protect was meant to be about that, but let's be absolutely honest. In Syria, no one has taken responsibility and no one has been protected. Now, we also have to deal with the charge of selectivity and at times hypocrisy, that we have not been consistent in our choice of when to act, or that countries have chosen to act when there is much at stake for them, but not when there isn't. And I say that is a reasonable criticism, and on occasions it has force. But the argument that just because you have failed to do the right thing everywhere, you should not attempt to do the right thing anywhere is one that I find profoundly unconvincing. Now, of course, in the case of all conflict, prevention is better than cure. And there is nothing more important than putting time, energy, and effort into trying to prevent violent conflict in the first place. Particularly important is the UN's capacity to mediate and so help the parties to resolve their differences without turning to violence. So we need skilled people, teams that can be deployed to go and support talks around the world, as Staffan de Mistura and Bernardino Leon are currently trying to do in Syria and Libya. Few civil wars arise from nowhere, so we need to be better at monitoring and understanding the causes of tension, the exclusion and the injustice that makes people angry. And the establishment of the Atrocity Prevention Board by the United States government is a particularly good example of seeking to do that. Now, if all of this sounds a bit depressing, then 2 decades ago things were much worse. About half of the countries in Africa were then affected by violence, many in regional conflicts across West and Central Africa. Now we can look back and say that sub-Saharan Africa was the only region in the world to see a decline in violent conflict at the start of the 21st century. Much of that is down to the pioneering work of the African Union and its Peace and Security Council. It can deploy military forces in situations which include genocide and crimes against humanity. It can also authorize peacekeeping missions. The AU has put troops on the ground in Burundi, the Central African Republic, Darfur, and most recently in Somalia, in the form of AMISOM, which is a regional mission operating under a UN mandate. We're getting better at negotiating peace. According to the Human Security Report, the international community has negotiated more settlements to conflicts in the last 15 to 20 years than in the 185 years previously. And finally, when all of this is done, we need to end up where we began, with the rule of law, so that we can call those responsible to account. And that is why the UK has been such a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court, because the message it sends is clear and simple. Anyone who is planning crimes against humanity should think twice, because they know they will end up, and the international community will catch them and put them on trial, as Slobodan Milosevic and Radko Mladic both discovered. And the reason why we should want international action at the United Nations to succeed is that it is about demonstrating that multilateralism, in other words, the nations of the world working together, can provide the answer to the uncomfortable question, what is to be done? And the more it does succeed, the stronger is the argument we can make to those who would act unilaterally that there is another way of dealing with the problem. Now, I would like to finish on a note of optimism. 100 years ago, this year, my grandfather, William, fought in Gallipoli in the First World War. He lost his younger brother, Oliver, in that campaign. His is one of 22,000 names on the Helles Memorial. His body was never found. And my grandfather lost his eldest son, the Uncle Michael I never knew, in World War II. He was an RAF pilot. And this is what my grandfather wrote about war. Is there anyone now who will deny that step by step warfare degrades a nation? Soldiers know from bitter experience what militarism really means. It's stupidity, it's brutality, it's waste. They are chivalrous because they have learned the one good thing that war can teach, namely that peril shared knits hearts together. Yes, even between enemies. They have mingled with strangers. They know that common folk the world over love peace and in the main desire goodwill. Now, nearly a century after he wrote those words, I think they remain true. Human beings everywhere yearn for peace. And if together we can make our politics work in the service of humankind, then we will bring nearer the day on which that hope, in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is fully realized. Thank you very much.